In a quiet suburban neighborhood, the Wilson family appeared to live a peaceful life. Margaret Wilson, a mother in her 50s, was known for her strict and traditional values, raising her only daughter, Emma, with those same beliefs. But behind closed doors, tensions were rising, and a dark secret was about to be uncovered. Emma, a 24-year-old woman full of life and dreams, had fallen in love with David, a man her mother strongly disapproved of. Margaret believed David wasn't good enough for her daughter, and she was determined to stop their relationship at all costs. As Emma's wedding day approached, Margaret's disapproval grew into a dangerous obsession. She couldn't bear to see her daughter marry someone she deemed unworthy, and soon her protective instincts took a tragic turn. What started as a mother's attempt to control her daughter's future ended in a crime that shocked the entire community. In a desperate bid to prevent the marriage, Margaret made a decision that would destroy her family forever. Stay tuned as we uncover the heartbreaking story of a mother's love turned deadly, and how a family was torn apart by a decision that went too far. This is the story of a mother's crime, driven by a desire to control her daughter's life, with tragic consequences no one could have foreseen. Margaret Wilson's upbringing had shaped her into a person who valued structure, tradition, and most importantly, family reputation. Raised by strict, conservative parents, Margaret grew up believing that every decision she made had to reflect positively on the family. Her marriage to Thomas Wilson, a successful banker, had reinforced these ideals. Together, they had built a life of stability and comfort, and their only child, Emma, was meant to carry on the family legacy with the same values. From the moment Emma was born, Margaret was fiercely protective, always keeping a close eye on her daughter's life. As Emma grew into a bright and curious child, Margaret's need for control over her daughter's future only intensified. Margaret saw herself as the architect of Emma's success, ensuring she attended the best schools, cultivated the right friendships, and upheld the family's reputation at all times. But as Emma entered her teenage years, her natural independence began to clash with her mother's controlling nature. Emma had always been an imaginative child, and by the time she reached high school, she wanted more freedom to explore her identity. She joined clubs that Margaret disapproved of, made friends from different backgrounds, and expressed opinions that contradicted her mother's traditional views. This growing independence caused tension between mother and daughter. Margaret dismissed Emma's desires as teenage rebellion, believing that her daughter would eventually come back to her senses. Margaret's love for Emma was deep, but it was entangled with a desire for control that she couldn't let go of. As Emma entered adulthood, she pursued a career as a nurse, a decision that Margaret supported in theory but struggled with in practice. Margaret had always envisioned Emma marrying a man from a well-established family, someone who would complement their social standing. To Margaret, Emma's career was a stepping stone to meeting the right kind of man, not a path to independence. Emma, however, saw her work as an expression of who she was: a compassionate, empathetic woman who wanted to help others. The more time Emma spent at the hospital, the more she realized that her mother's values didn't align with her own. She was growing into a woman who wanted to make her own choices, even if that meant going against her mother's wishes. Margaret, meanwhile, watched with growing unease as Emma drifted further from the life she had envisioned for her. Emma's dedication to her career, her late hours at the hospital, and her new circle of friends began to worry Margaret. She feared that Emma was losing touch with the family's values and, even worse, that she might meet someone outside their social circle, a man who wouldn't live up to Margaret's expectations. Then, it happened. Emma met David. David was a kind, hard-working man with a modest upbringing. He had grown up in a small town, working his way through college, and now had a steady job in construction management. He wasn't wealthy, but he had a strong work ethic and a heart full of love for Emma. The two met by chance, introduced by mutual friends at a hospital charity event. From the moment they met, there was an undeniable connection between them. At first, Emma didn't introduce David to her mother. She knew how Margaret would react, but as her relationship with David deepened, Emma felt compelled to tell her mother the truth. She was in love with him, and he made her happier than anyone ever had. The day Emma brought David home to meet her mother, Margaret's reaction was exactly what Emma had feared. Margaret's warm smile faded the moment she laid eyes on him. She asked pointed questions about his background, his family, and his career. Emma watched in silence as her mother scrutinized every detail of David's life. By the end of the evening, Margaret had made up her mind David was not the man she had planned for her daughter. In the weeks that followed, Margaret's disapproval became more vocal. She warned Emma that David was only interested in her for her money, that he wouldn't be able to provide the stability she deserved. Emma, however, stood firm. She loved David for who he was, not for his wealth or status. She didn't care about the things her mother valued. But Margaret wasn't listening. Margaret's attempts to undermine the relationship became more desperate. She began calling Emma at all hours, offering unsolicited advice about marriage and warning her of the dangers of marrying beneath her. Emma, who had always respected her mother, was growing tired of the constant interference. She began spending more time with David and less time at home, creating a distance that only fueled Margaret's anger. The tension between mother and daughter reached its peak when Emma and David announced their engagement. Margaret was furious. She felt betrayed, as though Emma had chosen David over her family. In her mind, Emma's decision was a personal attack, a rejection of everything Margaret had worked so hard to instill in her daughter. As the engagement went on, Margaret's anger festered. She couldn't understand why Emma was so determined to marry a man who, in her eyes, wasn't good enough. She began to see David as a threat, not just to Emma's future, but to the family's reputation. And as her obsession with controlling Emma's life grew, Margaret's thoughts turned darker. She started to believe that the only way to save Emma was to stop the marriage by any means necessary. With the engagement looming, the strain in the Wilson household became unbearable. Margaret's once gentle demeanor turned cold, and every interaction with Emma was filled with tension. Emma had moved out of her childhood home and into an apartment with David, a decision that infuriated Margaret. She saw it as another sign that Emma was slipping away, falling further under David's influence. Family gatherings, which had once been filled with warmth and laughter, now felt like battlegrounds. Margaret would seize every opportunity to criticize David, making sharp, passive-aggressive comments about his job, his family, and his future prospects. David, who had initially tried to win Margaret over, eventually stopped trying. He knew that no matter what he did, he would never meet Margaret's impossible standards. Emma, caught between the man she loved and the mother she had always looked up to, felt emotionally exhausted. She had spent years trying to please her mother, but for the first time in her life, she was putting her own happiness first. The decision to marry David wasn't just an act of love, it was a declaration of independence. And that was something Margaret couldn't accept. As the wedding day approached, Margaret's behavior grew more erratic. She began calling Emma multiple times a day, pleading with her to reconsider the marriage. When that didn't work, she started visiting unannounced, showing up at Emma and David's apartment with unsolicited advice and warnings. Emma, who had always been close to her mother, was heartbroken by the change in their relationship. But no matter how hard she tried to reason with Margaret, it was clear that her mother was spiraling out of control. Margaret's obsession with stopping the marriage consumed her every waking thought. She would spend hours pacing the house, replaying conversations with Emma in her head and convincing herself that she was right. In her mind, she was the only one who could save Emma from making the biggest mistake of her life. And as her desperation grew, so did her belief that drastic action was necessary. One evening, after another heated argument with Emma, Margaret sat alone in the kitchen, her mind racing. She had tried everything: reasoning, guilt, manipulation, but nothing had worked. Emma was determined to marry David, no matter the cost. Margaret felt helpless, as though she had lost control of the situation. And in that moment of despair, a dark thought entered her mind. What if she could stop the wedding? What if Emma never made it to the altar? The thought was terrifying, but once it had taken root, Margaret couldn't shake it. She had spent years shaping Emma's life, guiding her toward a future that aligned with the family's values. And now, in a matter of months, David had taken all of that away. Margaret felt as though she had been backed into a corner, and the only way out was to eliminate the source of the problem. At first, Margaret dismissed the idea as a moment of madness. She couldn't possibly hurt her own daughter. But as the days went by, the thought lingered in the back of her mind, growing stronger with each passing day. She began to convince herself that she was doing it for Emma's sake, that by preventing the marriage she was saving her daughter from a lifetime of regret. Margaret's obsession reached its peak the night before the wedding. Emma had gone to bed early, exhausted from the stress of planning the big day. Margaret, however, was wide awake, her mind racing with thoughts of what the future would hold if Emma married David. She couldn't bear the thought of watching her daughter throw her life away for a man who wasn't worthy of her. That night, as the house lay quiet, Margaret made the decision that would change everything. She quietly walked into Emma's room, where her daughter lay sleeping peacefully, unaware of the danger that was looming. Margaret stood over her daughter for a moment, tears streaming down her face as she wrestled with the gravity of what she was about to do. In her twisted mind, she believed that this was the only way to save Emma from herself. With trembling hands, Margaret reached for the pillow on Emma's bed. She pressed it down over her daughter's face, her heart pounding in her chest as Emma struggled beneath her. The struggle was brief, and within moments, Emma lay still. Margaret stood there for a long time, staring down at the daughter she had loved and nurtured for 24 years. In her mind, she had done what was necessary. She had saved Emma from making a mistake that would ruin her life. But as the reality of what she had done set in, Margaret felt a wave of horror wash over her. She had killed her only daughter, and there was no going back. The night before the wedding, the Wilson household was filled with an eerie quietness. Emma had spent the evening with her close friends, enjoying a small pre-wedding gathering. She was nervous but excited, ready to begin a new chapter in her life with David. Her friends had noticed her subtle anxiety, which she attributed to the typical pre-wedding jitters, but in truth it was Margaret's cold, cutting words that weighed heavily on her mind. That evening, Emma returned to her childhood home one last time before the wedding, where she planned to stay the night. Margaret had barely spoken to her, giving her short, clipped responses when she asked simple questions about the wedding arrangements. Margaret's disapproval had been growing louder with every passing day, and Emma could feel the tension suffocating the air between them. As Emma brushed her hair in front of the mirror, she reflected on the woman who had raised her. Margaret had always been a guiding figure in her life, instilling values of discipline and hard work. But she had also been controlling, molding Emma's life like a sculptor creating a statue. Emma had never fully broken free of that control until David came into her life and gave her a sense of independence and love that her mother could never provide. Emma climbed into bed, exhausted from the day's preparations but filled with excitement about the life she was about to embark on. Despite her mother's harsh words, she knew in her heart that marrying David was the right decision. She whispered a quiet prayer before closing her eyes, feeling confident that the future would bring happiness. Meanwhile, in the room down the hall, Margaret lay awake in her bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind was racing with thoughts of Emma walking down the aisle the next day. But instead of joy, Margaret felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She believed that Emma was throwing away her life, making a mistake so monumental that it would destroy both of them. Margaret's chest tightened with anxiety as she pictured her daughter standing next to David, the man who she believed was manipulating and using Emma for his gain. Margaret's obsessive thoughts consumed her, spiraling into a dark place she had never gone before. Her love for Emma had become twisted, a toxic mixture of control and desperation. In her mind, she wasn't just losing a daughter, she was losing her legacy, her family's values, and everything she had spent her life building. As the hours ticked by, Margaret's emotions became more volatile. The thought of her daughter slipping away from her forever was unbearable. She began to pace the room, wringing her hands as her mind raced. The more she thought about it, the more certain she became that she couldn't let the wedding happen. Emma wasn't thinking clearly. She was being manipulated. Margaret had to stop it by any means necessary. Around 2 a.m., Margaret reached her breaking point. She stood in front of the window, staring out into the darkness, the moonlight casting long shadows on the walls of her room. She could hear the quiet breathing of Emma in the next room, peacefully asleep, unaware of the danger lurking just beyond her door. Margaret felt a wave of grief wash over her, but it was followed by something darker resolve. She moved with quiet precision, her steps deliberate as she made her way toward Emma's room. Her hands trembled as she opened the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She told herself she was saving Emma from a lifetime of regret. In the haze of her emotions, Margaret had convinced herself that her actions were justified. Inside the room, Emma lay peacefully under the covers, her breathing slow and rhythmic. Margaret stood over her daughter, tears streaming down her face. Her vision blurred as she reached for the pillow. She pressed it down over Emma's face, her movements swift but shaky. Emma struggled beneath the weight of the pillow, her body thrashing in an instinctual fight for survival. But Margaret held firm, her tears mixing with the overwhelming pressure of what she was doing. The room fell still within moments. Emma's body went limp, her life snuffed out by the hands that had once cradled her as a baby. Margaret dropped the pillow and collapsed beside Emma, sobbing uncontrollably. For a moment she couldn't move. The weight of her actions bore down on her like a crushing wave. She had done the unthinkable, killed her only daughter. Hours passed, though Margaret couldn't tell how long she had been sitting there. The sun had begun to rise, casting a pale glow into the room. Margaret finally stood, her legs shaky, her mind numb. She wiped her face with trembling hands, trying to make sense of what she had done. She told herself that it was for the best, that Emma had been saved from making a terrible mistake. But the truth was undeniable: Margaret had committed murder. The following morning, the Wilson household was filled with a quiet anticipation as family members and friends gathered in preparation for the wedding. David had arrived early, excited and nervous for the big day. He exchanged small talk with Emma's family, though his mind was solely focused on his bride-to-be. As time passed, people began to wonder where Emma was. She hadn't come downstairs for breakfast, which was unlike her. David tried calling her phone, but there was no answer. He assumed she was getting ready, maybe taking a moment to herself before the ceremony. But as the hours dragged on, concern began to spread among the guests. By midday, the house was filled with a tense silence. David, along with Emma's closest friends, decided to check on her. They knocked on her bedroom door, calling her name, but there was no response. When they pushed the door open, the sight that greeted them was one of horror. Emma's lifeless body lay on the bed, her face pale, her lips tinged with blue. David rushed to her side, shaking her, calling her name, but it was too late. Emma was gone. The room erupted into chaos as her friends screamed and cried, calling for help. David fell to his knees, his world shattering around him. The police arrived shortly after, taking control of the scene and beginning their investigation. At first glance, it appeared that Emma had died in her sleep. There were no immediate signs of a struggle, no blood, no indication of foul play. But as detectives began to examine the room more closely, they found subtle clues that pointed to something far more sinister. Margaret had been strangely quiet since the discovery of Emma's body. She avoided eye contact with the investigators, her face pale and her hands trembling. She claimed she had no idea what had happened, that Emma had seemed perfectly fine the night before. But there was something off about Margaret's demeanor, something that didn't sit right with the detectives. As the investigation continued, more details about the strained relationship between Margaret and Emma came to light. Family members revealed the growing tension between the two, particularly in the weeks leading up to the wedding. Friends of Emma told detectives about the arguments, the ultimatums, and Margaret's obsessive disapproval of David. It became clear that Margaret had been increasingly unstable, consumed by her need to control Emma's life. Forensic experts examined Emma's body and determined that she had died of suffocation. The absence of defensive wounds suggested that the killer had struck while she was asleep, taking her life without giving her a chance to fight back. The evidence began to build, and all signs pointed to someone close to Emma, someone who had access to her room in the middle of the night. The detectives turned their attention to Margaret. Her strange behavior, coupled with the tension between her and Emma, raised red flags. They brought her in for questioning, and under the pressure of the investigation, Margaret's calm facade began to crack. At first, she denied any involvement, insisting that she had been asleep in her room when Emma died. But as the detectives pressed her further, Margaret's story began to fall apart. She contradicted herself, stumbling over details, and eventually she broke down in tears. In a tearful confession, Margaret admitted to killing Emma. She told the detectives that she had done it to save her daughter from making a terrible mistake, that she believed she was protecting Emma from a life of misery. Her confession was filled with delusion and self-justification, as she tried to convince herself that what she had done was for Emma's own good. The detectives listened in stunned silence as Margaret recounted the events of that fateful night. She had crept into Emma's room, driven by a twisted sense of duty, and ended her daughter's life in the name of control. Margaret had convinced herself that she was acting out of love, but the truth was far darker. As the police led Margaret away in handcuffs, the reality of what she had done finally set in. Emma was gone, her life cut short by the very person who was supposed to protect her. Margaret had destroyed not only her daughter's future but her own as well. The trial of Margaret Wilson captivated the nation. People were glued to their televisions and smartphones, reading every detail of a case that seemed almost too tragic to be real. A mother, driven to murder her own daughter to prevent a marriage she disapproved of, was a storyline fit for fiction, but the reality was even more heartbreaking. In the courtroom, Margaret was a shadow of the strong-willed woman she had once been. Her hair, once neatly styled, now hung limply around her gaunt face. She avoided eye contact with the gallery, where both strangers and loved ones sat, waiting for answers. The prosecution wasted no time in presenting their case. Margaret, obsessed with control, had suffocated her daughter in a fit of delusion and jealousy. They painted a picture of a woman whose love for her daughter had warped into something toxic, culminating in a fatal act of violence. The defense, on the other hand, tried to argue that Margaret had been mentally unstable at the time of the murder. They claimed she had acted out of an irrational, distorted sense of love and protection. They brought in psychologists who testified that Margaret had developed a delusional obsession with saving Emma from what she saw as a disastrous marriage. They argued that Margaret hadn't fully grasped the consequences of her actions, that in her mind she was saving Emma's future, not ending it. Despite these arguments, the jury was not swayed. The cold facts of the case remained: Margaret had taken her daughter's life while she lay defenseless in her bed. No amount of explanation could erase the horror of that act. After deliberating for only a few hours, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The sentencing was swift. Margaret was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a fitting punishment for a crime that had left so much devastation in its wake. As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, the reality of her actions finally seemed to sink in. Her face crumpled, and for the first time she openly wept, her sobs echoing through the courtroom. The aftermath of the trial was felt by everyone involved. The Wilson family, once tight-knit, was torn apart. David, now without the love of his life, was left to mourn not just the woman he had lost, but the life they had planned together. Friends and relatives who had once gathered in the Wilson home now avoided it, too haunted by the memories of what had happened. The house itself became a symbol of the tragedy, standing empty and abandoned, a reminder of a future that would never come. Margaret's crime left a wound that would never fully heal. The legacy of control, obsession, and violence served as a chilling reminder that even the purest of emotions, love, could turn deadly when taken to an extreme. The loss of Emma Wilson, a young woman full of promise, was a sorrow that the community and the nation would not soon forget.